Hello, everyone. I'm Kevin Allen, and I'm joined by my regular podcast partner, Bob Duff, on the HockeyDebates.com podcast. And our special guest today is Mike Augello, who's, you may know him from Mike from Buffalo. He's actually the beat writer for the Toronto Maple Leafs for Hockey Buzz, but he lives in Buffalo. And today, of course, the story is in Buffalo. As I wrote in my lead, I got an email from somebody who just said in the subject line, "Wow, what a mess!" And I knew exactly what they were talking about.
Yeah.
And Mike, the issue from my perch is the Pagolas have owned the team since 2011, and in the season they took over, there was a 43-win season. They haven't gotten 43 wins since they took over, and they only made the playoffs in that 1 year. They bought it in February. They made the playoffs, and they haven't made the playoffs since. I mean, I think if I'm Terry and Kim Pegula, I'm got to look in the mirror and say, I bear some of the responsibility for what's going on there.
Well, everybody is looking at them in terms of the responsible parties. You can't miss the fact that, if you look at team presidents, general managers, coaches, I believe it's over a dozen now, from Lindy Ruff and Darcy Regier to Pat LaFontaine and Ted Nolan, Tim Murray, Ted Black. You just roll through these names, and this is the number of people that they've had over those 9 years. And the one common thread is that they haven't made the playoffs with any of them. Now, I'm not, Jason Botterill had his critics, and I was one of them. They came into this year, and the thought was that he was fairly safe in his job after, entering his third season as general manager of the Sabres. He inherited a lot of problems from Tim Murray. That being said, I think, he made some good moves. He made some really bad moves. But even in February, when things started to turn on him, it was mostly a 50-50 proposition that he would stay as general manager of the Sabres. And then 3 weeks ago, Kim Pegula, who is team president as well as co-owner, came out through John Worrell of the Associated Press and said, Jason Botterill is staying as general manager. 3 weeks later, they fire him. So, I mean, the desire of the fan base in Buffalo was for Botterill to be gone because he hadn't done a good job. So they really did the worst potential PR move they could by keeping a guy that people wanted to have fired, and then 3 weeks later firing him because they look completely dysfunctional. And now they have hired a GM with absolutely no managerial experience in Kevin Adams, former NHLer Kevin Adams, who was working as a VP of business administration and was a former assistant coach I think 8 or 9 years ago, but had been in charge of the Harbor Center. That was his main claim to fame. But he's been somebody they've groomed, and now they bring him in as the general manager, and they're not going to hire a president of hockey operations. They're not going to hire anybody else. It's going to be Terry and Kim Pegula, Kevin Adams, and Ralph Kruger. And I don't know if that's a recipe for success either.
Well,
Go ahead, Bob.
What I'm going to say is, how much of this you say, Kevin says they got to look in the mirror. How much of this are they meddling owners? Are they interfering owners? Is it hard to work for them?
I definitely think that they meddle. I mean, you have to say this. Terry Pegula, when he bought the Sabres back in 2011, made it painfully clear that he was a Sabres fan. And that's not a bad thing to have a billionaire fan take over as the owner of the team. And this is after, you had the situation with the Regises, who, John Regas went to jail, and Tom Golisano picked up the team out of bankruptcy and saved the team, but wasn't really interested in spending any money. It was refreshing to have Terry Pegula come in and say, I want to spend. And that first year, he went out and they traded for Brad Boyes and spent some money and made the playoffs. And then in free agency bought up Ville Leno and Christian Ehrhoff. But they're the poster child of throwing money at the problem, not that is not always the solution. And the problem is, I think in terms of management situations, they have wanted to be more hands-on, and I think it's been to the detriment of the franchise because they're just not allowing their hockey people to fully operate the franchise. And I think some of the problems have been they've chosen the wrong hockey people. And Tim Murray, was a pretty much a disaster here. And Botterill was well regarded after his work in the Pittsburgh organization. The reason that they mentioned in terms of why he was fired, they said in the press statement, philosophical differences, but in the conference call that they just had about an hour ago, they said, well, it was a breakdown in communication. Well, I don't think it was a breakdown in communication. Pretty much everybody knew if Botterill was going to keep his job after next season, they would have to make the playoffs. And I got the general impression that they weren't going to allow him to do what he needed to do to make the playoffs, meaning maybe spend some money, go out and get some players. They're financially right now not in line with spending a ton of money, and that's why I think he eventually just lost his job.
Mike, like in fairness, I thought it was a good hire when they got Botterill. Like you mentioned, he came with solid credentials, smart guy, analytical in his approach, very aggressive. Like he was very aggressive, but his batting average wasn't very high in terms of the success rate of his moves. He did a lot, and you want an aggressive general manager. At least I do. But he didn't get it done. And this is a result-oriented business. So, it's not surprising he would lose his job. Where I think Augello fell down is his foot. He obviously made some bad hires in Tim Murray, and it just seems like too much. The Sabres were falling victim to. They have too much going on elsewhere, including the Buffalo Bills, who actually have made the playoffs a couple of times in the last 3 seasons. But what I think really dooms them in terms of being subjected to criticism is the fact that it doesn't seem like they have a plan. Just as you call them, dysfunctional. 3 weeks ago, Botterill was in, and now he's out. Like, why wasn't he fired 3 weeks ago? You didn't know? You weren't close enough to him to know that you guys had a difference of opinion on what was going to happen? Did you just reveal that to him? Because most of the teams have gone through a self-analysis during this pandemic. Like the Blackhawks have gone through that, where Rocky Wirtz has decided because he had time on his hands to do everything. So they just look like they don't really have a real direction and plan for what they're doing.
Yeah, and I believe it was Kim Pegula who said that they decide one of the factors was, well, we found out that the draft was going to be in October instead of in June, and if the draft was in June, then we wanted to keep everything in place, and because we had some time to evaluate the situation, we decided to make a change. If that's the one of the main reasons why you made this decision, then I really question their judgment. And it was Mike Harrington from the Buffalo News who basically asked them why any fan would have any confidence in their ownership and in their management of the franchise when they operate in such a scattershot manner. And I really, and they never really answered the question when he asked it. So you can just see examples. Like the Pat LaFontaine situation from a few years back where they hired him as team president, and then essentially he finds out 4 months later that he doesn't really have any power because Tim Murray decides to make a trade that he doesn't want to make, and he's overruled by the ownership. But even in the most recent management situation, the Ryan O'Reilly trade, which is, I think, the signature move made by Botterill, that trade was instigated by the fact that the Sabres did not want to pay a signing bonus, his signing bonus on July 1st, and they got significantly less in that deal because St. Louis agreed to pay the signing bonus rather than the Sabres. The Sabres could have had a lot more than Patrick Berglund and Vladimir Sobotka and Tage Thompson in return for a guy who turned out to be the Conn Smythe Trophy winner. If they would have agreed to pay the signing bonus, it probably would have gotten a lot better in terms of a return. And in that case, they didn't. So I don't know how much Botterill can be blamed for some of the things that he did and how much it's to blame of the ownership that forced him to do those things.
Yeah, I'm not even sure that I said at the time I didn't understand why they were so hell bent on trading Ryan O'Reilly, and what do they need most right now? Number 2 center.
Well, he came out at the end of the season, over 2 years ago, and essentially questioned the direction of the franchise. Something that Jack Eichel just did similarly in the end of season availability a couple weeks ago. The problem is they can't trade Jack Eichel because Jack Eichel is the best player in the team and the best player on the franchise. Whereas O'Reilly, if he was going to start to raise a stink, being in his late 20s, being in his prime at that point, they saw the road a couple years down the road where he was going to probably be causing a problem. So they decided to cut bait in that sense, and they could make a deal at that point and get a return for him. But they didn't maximize the opportunity to get as much as they could for him by, eating some money. They were intent on moving him out if he didn't buy into the plan. But again, I don't know what the plan is, and nobody in Buffalo knows what the plan is.
Oh, we saw, at the beginning of 2 seasons ago, early in the year, when Buffalo was actually number 1 in the NHL for a brief time, went on that long winning streak. Mm-hmm. People started to think, all the years of pain were finally going to show some dividends, and then they went right back off the rails again and haven't been able to right the ship again since. Mm-hmm. Was that just smoke and mirrors, or is there actually a core here that this team, if you got the right people in charge, could be something to be reckoned with?
I mean, there is a core. There are, I'd say, 3 or 4 really good players. There's just not enough of one to sustain it. I mean, at that point, when they won the 10 games in a row, anything Jeff Skinner touched went in the net. Jack Eichel was playing great. They were getting good goaltending out of Carter Hutton. Carter Hutton, I believed ever since they got him from St. Louis as a free agent. He's not a number 1 goaltender. He's a caretaker, 1B type of goaltender. He's not a number 1 starter. So everything went right at that point for them in those 10 games. I think they won 3 or 4 of them in overtime. Everything was going great, and then reality set in. And late in the season, I mean, they were the worst franchise in the NHL after January 1st, after being number 1 in the NHL in mid-November. So the turnaround was dramatic. And this year, they were one of the best teams in the NHL in October. They were great in October, and then things fell apart. So, they have these moments when they're effective, but there's just not a deep enough reservoir of talent for them to sustain it. And like, for example, this year, as Kevin mentioned earlier, with the trade of O'Reilly, their weakness was they didn't have a number 2 center behind Eichel, and they decided to address that issue by signing Marcus Johansson as a free agent from Boston. And Marcus Johansson hadn't played center in 7 seasons, and they signed him as the de facto number 2 center, and that just wasn't going to work. And throughout the year, they tried Casey Middlestat, they tried Johansson, and then they made a trade at the deadline and brought in Dominic Cahoon from Pittsburgh, and they even tried him as a second-line center. None of it worked. So they've been trying to fill the hole that they created with the O'Reilly trade for 2 seasons.
Mike, you're a lifelong Buffalo resident. Mm-hmm. Can you kind of explain to those who don't appreciate what the Buffalo fan base is about? Like, I think they're one of the best fan groups in the NHL. When you look at the television ratings, they're always at the top when it comes to the number of households that are watching hockey. When you're watching national games and the Stanley Cup final, they're well represented, even though their team is usually out of the playoffs. Right. Like, this is a city that loves its hockey. Can you sort of shed some light on, like, how devoted this fan base is in Buffalo and how they just simply don't deserve this.
No, they don't deserve it, and I look at Buffalo as a franchise, and they've always operated having a little bit of an inferiority complex when it came to the big smoke up in Toronto, because that's the reason why when the Leafs come to Buffalo and Leaf fans buy up all the tickets at the KeyBank Center, it always it's always a bug in terms of the Sabres fans that, oh my God, how can all these Leaf fans come down here? But Sabres fans are practical. It's like, okay, they haven't made the playoffs in 9 years, so they sell off their tickets for that game to fund the rest of their season tickets for the rest of the year. They're practical. They don't like the fact that this team has struggled for as long as it did. This is a team that made the Cup Finals in '75 against the Flyers, made the Cup Finals in '99 against the Dallas Stars, and those two consecutive conference finals in 06 and 07. Those were the glory days with Briere and Drury and Ryan Miller. And they've been they expect their team to at least be competent. They will criticize if you think I'm negative when it comes to that's the usual MO of the Buffalo fan. They love their team until their team makes them doubt, and then they'll destroy them either on talk radio or when they're talking to their fans. They're passionate. They want their team to win, but they recognize. I think they're level-headed enough to recognize that when their team is flawed, they're going to call them out for it. And this team in the Pegula era has been extremely, extremely flawed. So right now I think it's probably at its worst when it comes to support for the Sabres. The season ticket base. I used to be a Sabres season ticket holder. They had a reserve list of 10,000 people. That's gone. Last year in the second half of the season, there were significant sections in the upper deck that were completely empty because people were sick and tired of watching losing hockey. They are going to have to win for their fans to come out and support them. They'll watch on TV because they can do that for free. They'll watch the playoffs because a lot of people in Buffalo love hockey. But I don't think they will support this team until they show them that they're good enough. And right now, they haven't shown them for a few years that they're not good enough.
All right, Mike. Well, we appreciate you taking the time to sit with us and talk about the Sabres. This is all the time we have for this segment, but we hope once the hockey starts up again and your Maple Leafs are playing again, we can get you on to talk about what they're doing.
Sounds good. Thanks, Kevin. Thanks, Bob.
Thanks a lot, Mike. Oops.
That's Mike Augello, who's normally a Maple Leafs writer but lives in Buffalo and certainly has an understanding, Bob, of the fan base there and what's been going on. And the interesting thing about all this is they're not that far away. Like if you look at this team, like they got Rasmus Dahlin, and of course they got Jack Eichel. That's like having Yzerman and Lidstrom in the early '80s. You got a dominant center. You got a great skilled two-way defenseman. They've got some nice pieces. Sam Reinhart's a good, decent player. Victor Olofsson has stepped up and has proven he could be a scorer as well. Rasmus Ristolainen has sort of implied that he might like to be traded, but he's the longest-standing trade rumor in the NHL. And I don't know why they trade him, because the minute you trade him, then you got to find a number two defenseman. So I don't know why I do that. But my point is, it wouldn't take much to get this team rolling. And they're in a tough division, but they could make the playoffs with a few good moves.
Yeah, I mean, if you compare them to, say, the Red Wings, I think you'd say they both probably have about 4 or 5 decent, solid NHL players, and I'd probably like their 4 or 5 better than the Red Wings 4 or 5. I'd rather have an Eichel and a Dahlin, like you say. But you wonder, in this era of COVID-19, everybody likes to spin conspiracy theories. Is Buffalo, from wide right to no goal to being the only NHL city where Scotty Bowman couldn't win, is Buffalo just a cursed sports town?
Yeah, especially when you add in that Scotty couldn't win because Scotty could win everywhere.
Yeah.
So yeah, no, that's an interesting thought. I was rooting for Botterill. I like him. I hope he gets another shot. Like it didn't work out, and to be honest with you, I can't defend him. The Skinner contract could really look stinky down the road. $9 million. He just didn't score enough last year to warrant that measure, and they got 7 years to go on that deal. I know he had scored 40 goals the year before, but I don't know. It's just that's going to come back to haunt him, and it's just too bad. Like I said, I appreciated the aggressiveness that Botterill has, but when you're going to be aggressive, your batting average has got to be, at least 500. You got to get half of them to work for you, and I don't think he batted 500 in his acquisitions. He tried to fix that defense last year, and I don't think he really was able to do that. And I don't know what happened to the breakdown, but like I said, they looked dysfunctional by saying 3 weeks ago that he was fine, and then suddenly making the decision that he's not fine.
It's kind of like that Daryl Sutter used to always say about potential. That potential just means you haven't done anything yet. Certainly when Jason Botterill wasn't a GM, I think he was thought of in the same kind of class as Kyle Dubas as one of these young up-and-coming stars that was going to make a great GM, and he was coveted by a lot of teams, and he didn't deliver the goods.
Yeah. Well, we're a result-oriented league. That's the way it's going to happen. Some interesting news in the sports world here, Bob. Their owners are painting a bleak picture of whether the deal's going to get done there, and baseball players are angry about it. Scherzer went after the commissioner with a tough tweet, and I find it interesting that in the NBA, there are some players that say to really kind of show the strength of the Black Lives Matter movement and to continue the protest of the deaths of the African Americans in America, that maybe they shouldn't play. Boy, that just would seem to fit into what has always appeared to be the most socially conscious league. Like the players in the NBA are political. There's no doubt about it. The coaches are political. They wear their politics on their sleeves, and I'm not surprised that this group of athletes is at least discussing whether or not they should not play as a form of protest.
Well, it's kind of a double-edged sword because people kind of want sports right now because so much is kind of going wrong in the world that it would be nice to have that distraction of the games people play. But at the same time, does society really want that distraction right now? It seems like we're on the cusp of some significant societal changes that are long overdue in North America. And do we want to be distracted from that, or do we want to keep the eyes on the prize and finally make this happen?
Yeah. Well, the other news yesterday, and I want to get your thoughts on this, because I was actually kind of stunned is too strong, but surprised that Commissioner Gary Bettman was quoted as saying about half the players in the NHL, I think 54% actually, are not in their home cities where their training camp is going to be. And most of them are going to have to quarantine before they enter their, bubble. That seems low to me. Like, we're starting here in July 10th. I would think they should be there and, already skating a little bit on the ice and so forth. I thought that number was low. I would have thought it would be 75%.
Yeah, I mean, that's again with Canada announcing today that they're going to extend the closure of the border to July 21st. How does that play into the hub city debate? I mean, certainly that would seem to put the three Canadian cities, Toronto, Vancouver, and Edmonton, on thin ice, so to speak, as far as their chances of getting a team, because getting a hub city designation, because Gary Bettman has been pretty adamant that they don't like that quarantine law in Canada, the 14 days. But yet, as you point out, it looks like the vast majority of players are still going to have to quarantine before they can go to work.
Yeah, like I thought that was really interesting information, and there's so many moving parts to this situation. In the U.S. we have states we're aggressively reopening the country, and in some states the number of people who have contracted the virus is increasing to a notable level, and I think there's a lot of concern about how this is going to work out. But let me ask you this. I had a conversation today with someone who knew, and it appears that if everything goes well, that they're going to allow, they being the NHL, the media to cover their teams. They just won't allow you to enter the bubble. In other words, you wouldn't be on the event level where the players are, but you could be in the press box and or watch from the stands, and you could then have a virtual interview with players. Of course, you could do that from your living room. You could sit there in your pajamas and watch the game, and then do a virtual interview. But suppose the hub Bob was in Toronto, would you go up and go knowing you couldn't get face to face with a player and sit in the stands or in the press box and watch the Maple Leafs toil in the playoffs and then do a virtual interview afterward?
I think I would not, because as you say, you can do it from home. So if you're going to do, like, if they're going to do some kind of Zoom setup to do interviews after the game, what's the point? I mean, it's not necessarily going into the rink that would be risking your health, but for me, I'd have to stay in a hotel if I went to Toronto. I'd be leaving my comfort zone, and I'm not really sure in Ontario if we're allowed to do that yet. They're very vague on the laws. I mean, Windsor is still on stage 1 where I live, so we're not allowed to do a lot of stuff that the rest of Ontario is allowed to do. And we're down to just 3 regions in the province where are still on stage 1 of the comeback to normalcy, and we're one of the 3. So, and Toronto is as well. So, I got to think that's got to impact Toronto's chances as well. They're still at stage 1, and most of the businesses in Toronto still aren't allowed to open. So you're going to start playing hockey in a city where you're telling 75% of the people they can't go to work.
Well, I think comfort is the right word. Comfortable. Yeah, I'm not sure I would be comfortable. And even though I don't think there's much risk of you sitting in a press box, you got to get there too. So you're, if I was living in Michigan, I'd have to drive there. Well, I'd stop and get gas. I'd probably want to go in and get a snack, get a Diet Coke. And, so there is some level of risk, although it's probably minimal. Is it worth it to go and get a virtual interview?
I can tell you right now, in Ontario, you can't go in and get a snack. You'd only be allowed to go to the drive-thru because none of those places are open yet.
Oh, they don't even allow yet.
They're just starting to have outdoor patios and restaurants in areas that have moved to stage 2, but they still can't open the restaurant itself. So we're still pretty locked down in Ontario. So I really doubt Toronto has much chance of getting a hub city designation, considering they're pretty much still at the stage of, where this all began, where you really can't do much of anything.
Yeah. Who do you think is going to get who are going to be the hub cities?
Well, I was kind of curious. Like, you hear a lot of talk about Columbus, and I know you've been there to cover Ohio State games. As Columbus, and then the other consideration you have to take in mind with Columbus, if this is going to extend into September, October, and there is a college football season, Columbus pretty much gets taken over by college football in the fall. So do you really want to have Columbus as a hub city if you're going to go beyond the fall and into September, October?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that's a good point. It's taken over on Saturday, so that'd be one day. Mm-hmm. Columbus is a nice town. It's a college town, so there are a lot of It's a nice area. So, and it's got the two rinks, the side by side rinks. Like you can walk out of your dressing room in the Blue Jackets arena and head right to go to the practice rink, or go left to go on the main ice. And they're 40 yards apart, if that. So I think that's one of the advantages. And I think there are other rinks in the area. The Ohio State is not far away. So I think that's one of the reasons why they would consider that. And there are a lot of hotels, because you need hotels to accommodate, Buckeye football. So there are, and I think there's probably a lot of openings in those hotels, except on the Saturdays when the Buckeyes are playing. Anyway, as usual, we've moved quickly through our 30 minutes, and we appreciate your listening. We'll be back later in the week. We'll have another guest, and we'll be talking about it. Today, it was very timely to have some news today with the firing of Jason Botterill, and able to get Mike Augello, who lives in Buffalo and has a great understanding of the frustrations of being a Buffalo fan.
Well, it's good to see everyone again today, and we'll be back on Thursday. And enjoy your day and stay safe. And we'll see you in a couple days.